over anything. We've only got about 45 minutes here today. So I'm Patrick Wolf. I work at CloudBees. I'm the Director of Product Management there, mostly overseeing Jenkins and our pipeline product. And today I'm here to talk about our new declarative pipeline and how that can be used with Artifactory for storing artifacts or publishing over to bin tray as well. I don't have bin tray in my demo, but it is possible to integrate with that. So a little bit about me. I am Director of Product Management. We have several for that. And again, I focus on Pipeline and Jenkins, so I'm not necessarily selling anything of our products, but I feed into that. I'm kind of the base image for everything goes into our products. Basically on IRC, GitHub, Twitter, you can find me at HRMPW. It's a strange title or strange handle, but I've been using it for a long time, and it just kind of, it's always available, so I always use that. And yes, it is IRC for Jenkins. That's the way Jenkins has always been, so if you have to go old school to communicate with everybody on Jenkins for that. So what I want to talk about today is a real quick overview of Declarative Pipeline, an overview of Blue Ocean. Has anybody here tried Blue Ocean yet? Okay, quite a few people actually. Which is good. Then I'm going to go into a demo. So I'm going to spend about half my time on a demo today, just because I figured I don't want to bore you guys with just slides. You'll get enough of those. And then the last 10 minutes or so we'll take for questions if you have any. So is everyone here aware of stats.jenkins.io? All the stats that are collected anonymously from Jenkins are actually tracked at stats.jenkins.io, and they're available publicly to anybody that wants to go out and look at the stats for Jenkins. They're not really collated very well, but they are out there and you can actually go out and get them. So I've been pulling them down month by month and tracking everything. Right now there's about 150,000 Jenkins installations in the world, and those are only the ones that are reporting anonymously back to Jenkins, to the community. There are probably a lot more that turn the anonymous tracking off, so that, you know, we estimate about 20% above that for what's actually out there for Jenkins. We have about 70,000, 75,000 installations of the Pipeline plugin right now. That's been improved a lot since Jenkins 2.0 last year, where it's part of the recommended plugin set. And for that, I mean, we made the conscious decision, or Costa K and Jesse and those guys did last year, or 2 years ago when they first came out with Pipeline and Workflow, to make it a plugin because they wanted to move towards more of a plugin architecture for everything in Jenkins, as opposed to putting everything into core, which is why that was separated out. Currently in Jenkins, there are about 12 million jobs worldwide being run in Jenkins. That's up about 45 to 50% from last year. I think we were around 8 million last year at this time, and now we're at 12 million. And as of the end of last month, we're at 625,000 pipelines running across the world, and that's up by about 3,000% from last year. So we have been seeing a lot of good traction on Pipeline, and we're trying to drive even more of that now. So with Pipeline, we introduced that, God, it's been about 2.5, almost 3 years ago now. And 2 years ago at Juice West was the first time we really introduced Pipeline as code. Jesse Glick started showing off the Jenkins file with the GitHub organization. And the main goal of Pipeline as code is to make sure that we're keeping the pipeline for building the application, deploying the application, whatever you want to do with that, stored with the code itself. So it's actually portable. It's actually auditable. You can see the blame trail for who's modifying that pipeline. It's much more durable, and I'll get into that in a second for some of how that's more durable than a Freestyle job. It's extensible either through shared libraries or from writing your own plugins. And this allows for more dry and automatic jobs as well, because now with organization folders and multi-branch pipeline, it'll actually create the Jenkins job automatically and run it for you in that. And I thought this was a nice quote from talking with some people that they're absolutely loving Jenkins file and GitHub organizations, revolutionized how they've used Jenkins. This person in particular, everything was set up in GitHub. None of his users touched Jenkins. All he did was create a Jenkins file, and everyone ran their jobs through that. So he actually completely modified that. Sorry, I need to get a sip of water here. So hopefully everyone's familiar, but every year Jenkins community runs a survey for all users out there, and if you haven't seen it yet or participated, please do so in the future. This is really good. It feeds back into how Jenkins is going to be viewed for building for that. And it's not just a cloud-based thing, it is a Jenkins community survey for all users. And what we're seeing is that there's 20% that are beginning users, or self-identified as beginning users, and 60% almost identify as intermediate. That means they don't consider themselves experts in Jenkins. They're more casual users, and they're not just newbies for that. And only about a quarter of people consider themselves to be expert Jenkins users. And that's just Jenkins, not even Pipeline. Also, this is kind of hard to read because my graphic's a little small, but more and more users are using Jenkins beyond just CI and building tools. They're testing, they're publishing, deploying, and that's bringing in more and more new users that aren't familiar with Jenkins and what it does. So this is something that we've been very cognizant about in the last year, because Pipeline is really powerful, but it's also extremely more towards experts. It's a Groovy language to build pipelines, and you need to know Groovy, you need to know Jenkins. And so the two big things that we've been looking at doing is how do we bring this to the masses a lot more, and bring those people back into Jenkins a lot easier than having to learn Groovy and write imperative scripting to just get anything done. So the first thing is Declarative Pipeline. We released this in February. We've been working on it quite a bit. We first showed the first snapshot build at Jenkins World last year. Andrew Baer did a talk on it, and it's actually gone through quite a bit of revolution since then. We've added more and more steps, but we released in February with syntax complete, so we're not making any more major breaking changes with the 1.x, but we are going to add more and more features to it as we go. And the main goal was to make a much more declarative syntax. It's still brackets, and it's still Groovy under the covers, but what it is a much more defined, bound language that you're not able to break out of as easy. There's a much more structure to it as opposed to just free-form Groovy that you write in there. And if anybody has a question, we are adding more and more features to the Groovy side as well. The pipeline engine underneath isn't going to change. That's going to be continuous. It's just a different interface under the same way to create pipelines. So our first goal with this was to make sure that we could try to separate the concerns between having to understand what Jenkins was and what Jenkins was doing and being able to define a pipeline. We wanted to be able to write shared libraries in the background that could take care of creating the nodes and the agents, or just have somebody set that up. And the only thing the end user needed to know was the name of the agent. Or they could just say agent any and go through and do that. They didn't need to know the actual infrastructure setup of Jenkins to do anything. And that's one of the big things, is you get a lot of developers, other people coming in, and they don't understand what a node or an agent is, and they don't really care. So all they need to know is, I want my pipeline to do these 4 stages, and that's it. So that was one of the goals for our getting this declarative in. The other thing we talked about is one of the great strengths of Jenkins, and what everyone talks about is Jenkins pretty much lets you do anything, but that's also a big problem, is that Jenkins lets you do anything. There's 50 ways to do any one thing in Jenkins, and if you go on IRC, everyone's got a different answer on how to do things, which is fine, and it's great if you need that flexibility, but if you're coming into it fresh and raw, you just want some guideline on how to get there. And so we're trying to create more of a lit path to get people to their end goal faster, rather than go through and have to create their own snowflake to get to the same endpoint for everything. So it's much more structured in how it guides you to get to that endpoint, as opposed to having a free-form blank slate of a Groovy script to write that out. Another reason for doing declarative is that it's much more predictable. It's human readable as opposed to imperative Groovy. If I go in and see someone else's declarative pipeline, I can understand what their intention is right away. I don't have to break down their coding logic and try to reproduce what they're doing to be able to understand that. And also, because it's declarative and has a model, Blue Ocean and the pipeline visualization can actually look at that and say, I know what this is going to look like when it gets to the end, as opposed to an imperative Groovy script that we have to solve the halting problem for before we can actually display what it's going to look like. The last thing is we wanted to make sure that we could bring everybody into the process of looking at the pipeline, auditing the pipeline, and understanding what the pipeline is without knowing Groovy. So everybody in the organization that's touching on the pipeline can actually read it and participate in the code review process of that pipeline. They don't have to go out and learn Groovy, especially if they're a newbie user, to actually say, yes, this pipeline looks good to me. And especially new people coming onto the team, they can immediately pick that up and do that. So our recommendation is definitely if you're building pipelines, to use declarative as the structure for what the pipeline's doing. Put all of your code into shared libraries behind that, and let the end users work with just the declarative pipeline for building those pipelines out. That way it's a much more structured form of that. The shared libraries take care of all the complex things, and people don't have to worry about that unless they want to worry about that. And it makes everything a lot simpler. It also makes it a lot easier to share pipelines through the Jenkins community with that. So Blue Ocean, a lot of you have used it. What it is we were looking at Jenkins. This has gone back about a year or so. Kosuke has been really wanting to update Jenkins and give it a refresh on the UI because it is 11 years old now. The UI is, again, out there for a really long time. But to be able to do that, we can't just replace the Jenkins UI all at once. We have to actually start looking at it gradually. So Blue Ocean is the first step towards making a new UI for Jenkins. And because we want to push towards Pipeline, it's an application that's built as a plugin for Jenkins, which has its own UI for visualizing, creating, and just dealing with pipelines as well. And it's also meant to make it a much easier thing to bring new users on board with a much more appealing way to get involved with Jenkins. The classic UI is not going away. Everything that's there today will stay there. Blue Ocean is an alternative UI, but that can be presented to end users. So if you want to do configuration, administration, you can stay in classic UI, and the end users can just look at Blue Ocean for that. So, like I said, one of the primary factors of pipeline of Blue Ocean is to visualize the pipeline. We had stage view originally with Pipeline when it came out, and that had some limitations. One, it didn't do parallel. Two, it's kind of just really blocky and didn't have a lot of visual signals for things going on. And we wanted to build something that was much more, I guess, easy on the eyes, but also guide you through that. And we've also broken up the logs, and I'll show an example of this in a minute. But that's the primary purpose right now, is visualization of pipelines. It does work with Freestyle jobs, just so you know. It will show you that. The issue, though, is that Freestyle jobs are, by definition, basically a one-stage pipeline. So it's not going to show the stages in the visualization. It will show the logs and everything broken out in that and show you whether it was successful or failed or unstable, but it's not going to show you the kind of the railroad track view of that. With the release of 1.0, we did release a visual pipeline editor. I'll show this today as well. And this lets you create a pipeline in declarative directly from Blue Ocean that you can save back to your repository as a Jenkins file. So you don't even have to write code. You can actually just create this step by step through an editor. And we're actually adding quite a bit of more features to this as well. Right now, drag and drop isn't supported, and a couple other things, but we're iterated on that as fast as we can. This is a big thing that a lot of people are asking for. One other point is right now it only saves to GitHub because GitHub has a nice API to save a file to. But we're looking at integration with Bitbucket and GitLab and Perforce and all the other SCM providers as well. One other nice feature of Blue Ocean is it lets you personalize your view. So you always had My View in Jenkins, which was kind of clued you a little bit, but now if you just favorite pipelines, that'll show up as the first thing you see. And you can actually track those and see how your pipelines are doing without being bogged down by everybody else's pipelines if you want. So one of the biggest complaints that I've heard from people about Pipeline is the lack of documentation. And we've been working a lot on getting that up to date. We've redone Jenkins.io documentation. We've got a guided tour on how to get started with Declarative Pipeline. We've updated the pipeline handbook section. We've got a pipeline syntax reference that'll actually show you all the steps that are available in Declarative Pipeline, and talks about the difference between scripted and declarative, what's possible in one, what's not possible in the other, and just a general guide for when to do that. We've also updated the docs now with all the how to get started with Blue Ocean and run that out. This is going to keep growing. We're adding more and more as we can. I think the documentation in Jenkins has been one of the weak spots overall as a project. It's been a lot of loosely formed wiki pages forever, and now we're trying to take a guided, structured approach to how we're doing documentation across that and get as many people in the community involved as well. So if anybody wants to contribute documentation, feel free. It's an open source project out there to add documentation to. So with that, I'll stop the slides and go into a demo. So we've got about 20 minutes left, 25 minutes left, and hopefully it can show you this in action as opposed to just talking about it in slides. So I actually ran this earlier. If we can see that fine. So I've got my Jenkins file. I've ran that in Blue Ocean. It's actually paused. You can see it inputs required. So if I go into this, this is my game of life application that I'm building. My master is paused. My latest PR, so you can see run 4 and 4 here. My PR has been run as well because I found those. I've got those in a multi-branch pipeline job to do that. So this is what it looks like when it's waiting for user input. I've actually put an input step in there saying, hey, do you approve this? Do you want to go to the next stage to roll that out? So if I click on proceed here, it'll just go ahead and finish this off and deploy that image. So what this has done, and let me edit this. Let me do that. Yeah, they connect. Interesting. Okay, well, let me go into here. So I've got a bad connection to GitHub here. This is my pipeline, my Jenkins file in here, and this is all declarative. So the first thing is it needs a pipeline block around everything because it is just saying, hey, this is a declarative pipeline. You need to run it in declarative, and it knows what to expect and parse out based on that. The next line is agent any, which just means run on any available agent out there. Just give me an executor and let me run. I don't care where it is. And you can set up label. You can set up Docker. I've actually got an example below I'll show of Docker agent as well. So you can actually, this is a pluggable interface to write more agents in there. So right now it supports label, which is just a normal Jenkins label. It supports Docker, so you can run inside a Docker container. And we should have a Kubernetes plugin as well to be able to run this within Kubernetes very soon too. The environment section, I can set up my environment variables for use throughout my pipeline. In this case, I'm also setting up my credentials for my Jenkins credential store, just as ARTF, and that's going to actually take the Artifactory credentials that I've set up in Jenkins and use those for actually publishing to Artifactory at the end of the pipeline. The PostStep means run this when the pipeline is done. This is the last thing that happens for Jenkins. And the event for this is it's going to ignore everything else except for failures. When a failure happens in this pipeline, no matter where it is, it's going to send an email to the team with the current build, display name, the URL, and just say, hey, this failed, went on. So you can actually set up any notification in here. You can do HipChat notification, Slack notification, email notification. The email EXT works in here as well. So whatever notifications you're using can be used within the post steps. It doesn't have to be in the post step, but that's the most likely place to put them for that. And that can be for failure, unstable, changed, or success. Or you can have something in post for always, so it always runs at the end of the build. An example of that would be delete dir. If you want to clean your workspace as soon as you're done, you can run that at the end of the build. It wipes away your workspace every time. So the actual stages when I get into that for my build, my first stage, and I should point out here, With Declarative Pipeline, we're actually doing a checkout for you. As soon as the pipeline starts running and it gets a workspace, it will actually check out whatever the surrounding code for that Jenkins file is into your workspace and have that ready to go. So that's, you don't have to worry about checkout. It's already pre-built into the thing. If you want to override that, there's an option to override that. But by default, it will check out your code. So my first step is actually going to be by build my code. I've already got my code checked out, and I'm using a Maven image here. But what I'm using here for my agent is, the first thing is I'm reusing my node. So whatever my executor is running on, I'm reusing that, and I'm going to run Docker in that for my agent, and I'm going to use an image that I've stored up in Artifactory just called build tools. And this build tools image, what I've done is just taken Maven Alpine, and I added the JFrog CLI to as well in case I needed to use that. So it's the only two tools I really need, and it's the smallest image I could really create to just have my build tools on it. And it's actually going to run these steps inside that Docker container for me. But I'm using the mounted workspace that I've actually checked my code out into already. So I'm actually just taking the workspace, putting a container running on, mounted on that, and running steps in that. So I don't have to have any tools installed on my agent. All of my tools are coming from the container. So the first step is just to run with Maven, and this is part of the Maven pipeline plugin out there. And the Maven settings config tells Maven, in this case, where to find my settings.xml file. And I've created one specifically for being able to interact with Artifactory here, save that to my Jenkins configuration, and then I'm telling my pipeline where that is with this wrapper. And then I'm just running Maven within a shell step, and I'm actually cut it down, and I'm eliminating as many tests as possible just because for this demo I wanted to be able to finish in a reasonable time or else it went out. And I'm also running Maven deploy, and one of the reasons I did that is because I'm not as concerned about my artifact here, my jar file being part of the build and publish, but I am pushing that up to Artifactory here. So I've got my, and this is coming directly from my Maven step. It just automatically pushes that up to Artifactory for me. I don't have to worry about anything else. I put that into my POM XML. Hey, you know, distribute the build here when you do deploy, and it pushes it up for me. I don't even have to worry about that in my pipeline. And then if that's successful, again, the post step can be within a stage or at the top level. So this is per stage post build. So at the end of this stage, if you're successful, do this. And in this case, I'm just collecting my JUnit results and publishing those into Jenkins so I can actually look at those from the Jenkins UI afterwards to see how my tests have been doing across that. And if I don't succeed, then it just fails out and I don't even try that step for that. So now that I have my WAR file built for the game of life, the next thing I wanted to do is actually go back and build that as a Docker image. And so for this, what I'm going to do is I go into my directory that I want to use where my target WAR file is, and just say, hey, build this, and I've got a Docker file. Let me show the Docker file as well for that. So it's a very simple Docker file. Just take Jetty Alpine and copy in this WAR file, and that's it. So I'm taking the smallest container I can find, or image I can find, throwing my WAR file in that, and then I'm going to deploy that back up to Artifactory. Go back here, Jenkins file. So once I've built my new image here, it actually creates that for me. My next step is I want to publish that image, and I'm going to push that back to Artifactory so it can be used in other builds or other places for that. But I only want to do that on my master branch. I don't want every pull request and everything else coming in to actually publishing those to Artifactory. I want people to use that locally if they're doing pull requests, and I want to keep a canonical version up in my Artifactory store. So in this case, I'm only doing branch master, which the Win tells me. I skip anything else that's being built. Right now I'm running shell to connect to Artifactory with the Docker command and using my credentials, and this is where the credentials come in. So I'm passing in the Artifactory username, the Artifactory password, and connecting to Artifactory, tagging my new image, and then pushing that image up to Artifactory for that. There is a DSL step. You can do that in the Artifactory DSL, but I was having trouble getting my Artifactory reverse proxy working for that. It's much easier just to run this in shell for the purposes of the demo for that for me. And I kind of fall back to shell for a lot of things in Jenkins when something isn't working correctly. You know, the great thing about shell for running within Pipeline is that you can take what you're normally doing on your desktop, transfer that directly over into Jenkins and just automate the same thing you're doing on the desktop. You don't have to try to rewrite the same steps. You take a step that you've actually been running forever, just move that into Jenkins and make that part of your automation, which is one of the best things about shell. The other great thing about shell is that I know that shell is always going to run on my remote node. If you're using API commands from Pipeline, a lot of that can run from the master's JVM because the master is the one controlling the pipeline. And you want to make sure that you're taking advantage of your distributed system as much as possible. So if you're running from an agent with shell, it's always going to be distributed, and it's also always going to be durable. So the way the durability works in Pipeline is there's a new structure called the durable task plugin that Jesse wrote and Kosuke wrote for Pipeline. And instead of having a constant connection between the master and the agent, so if the master goes down in a Freestyle job, the agent fails as well because the connection's lost. With Pipeline, it's a durable task, so the agent and the master are talking asynchronously. And if the master goes down, the agent will continue executing until the master comes back up, or it will wait for the master to come back up, and then it'll reconnect to the master and continue on with the same pipeline that was running before. And this is the biggest reason why everything in Pipeline needs to be serialized, because every step that happens in Pipeline is actually serialized to disk. So if the master crashes and comes back up, or you restart the master for maintenance reasons, it comes back up and it just picks up where it left off and will keep going. So if you've got long-running builds that take 2 or 3 days to run, and you want to restart master or anything happens, you bring that back up and that pipeline continues to run. You don't have to worry about it restarting the entire pipeline from scratch. So the next step after actually deploying that is, again, only on master. So my last 3 steps are only run on master, my master branch from my GitHub repository. The next thing is to actually take that image. I'm re-downloading that image from Artifactory. And a script block here lets me run imperative pipeline groovy steps within declarative. So I'm actually breaking out of the declarative kind of structure and being able to run anything I want to from imperative pipeline that way. It's kind of an escape hatch. I don't necessarily recommend it for everyone, but it is a way, if you have some step that you just can't do in declarative, you can always break out and just run Groovy directly in that with the script command. So it's much more flexible that way for that. So in this case, I'm actually running the Docker image from the Docker Pipeline plugin, running that image, and inside, not inside that image, but while that image is running, which is what with run does. So it'll run the image as a container, and then while that's running, I do these steps externally to that. So in this case, I run my game of life, and then I put an input step there. So what I didn't show here, and I forgot to, is I ran that when it finishes to the end of my pipeline, it actually re-downloads that image for me, runs it in my Docker image, and puts that up on my, I can pull that up in my browser, and it's waiting for my input while I test that to make sure it looks good before I come back and say, yes, this looks good, and do that. And the last thing I wanted to do was do a deploy, but I couldn't get my, my build info working correctly. So you can actually, there's also a promote step within Pipeline for your Artifactory to be able to take a build info number and say promote this, and it'll actually promote it within Artifactory as well. Or you can actually take that same image and publish it to bin tray for downloading after that. So the last thing I wanted to go through was some of the different things in Blue Ocean. So this is the interface of Blue Ocean. I can always use this and go directly back to my same context in my classic UI. So I'm not losing anything there. I've got all this information here. I can jump back into Blue Ocean. This shows me all the steps that happen. If I click on any of these steps, it shows me the log files for what happened at that step. One thing is right now it says shell script, and that's changing. So we just got the code finished last week to actually specify what the actual script is that's being run in this interface. So it'll actually show up saying this, not just shell script, but specifically what was run there, which is much more informative than just shell script, because a lot of pipelines you'll see of just shell script, shell script, shell script, shell script over and over again. So that is coming. That's going to be a change coming in the next couple weeks. So we're very excited about that. The other thing I wanted to show here too real quick is in my PR, this is the same Jenkins file being run for a PR against my Game of Life interface. And because I said win master, these last 3 stages are skipped entirely. So they show up as purple question marks here because they were skipped. So this is a visual indicator that these are not run in this pipeline. They were there, but they were skipped intentionally for that. So the first 2 stages are exactly the same, except it's pulling from the PR build, from the merge on that PR and going out and running that, but it's not doing any of the deployment. So my tests, so all my tests are passing. My artifacts, I'm not storing any artifacts here. So the artifacts right now are tied to the artifacts stored in Jenkins, but I'm not a big believer in storing artifacts in Jenkins. I highly recommend using Artifactory or anything else external to Jenkins to store binary artifacts. You don't need to store those on your master, especially in Pipeline, because Pipeline, with all the new changes and Artifactory's DSL and shell scripts and everything else, it's much easier to go out and say, okay, take this, I can either stash it on master or I can actually push it up to Artifactory. Then on my next stage, I can actually download that same binary, do something else with, so I'm not tied up with trying to copy artifacts from one Freestyle job to another across this long chain of everything and trying to make sure I know what job number and what build number for everything. It's much more context aware for when I'm actually building that and transferring files back and forth. Let's see if I can actually... Yep, that worked that time. Okay, I was connected. So this is what the editor looks like. I've got a very straightforward pipeline. I have no parallels in here or anything. But my first build step, so this is the Maven environment settings. I can change that if I want to. My shell step that I'm running in here for Maven deploy. So I'm changing directory, and then I'm going in and running Docker build. So if I want to actually add something to the end of this, I can actually add and then add a step. I'm going to add let's delete through here. Yeah. So if I save that, it's actually what changed. So that's actually going to kick off a new run again, but if I go in here and so my last stage has been added there to clean up and delete dir. So this added it directly back into my Jenkins file, and it's rerunning that now with that new step for running that. And again, the delete dir is something you can actually run within a post-build action or something else. You don't necessarily need its own stage, but it is something nice to run that. You can also, with Docker, you can run Docker GC at the end of a build and clean up all of the images that you've created during that. If you're doing a lot of builds with Docker files and everything, you're going to get a huge amount of images that pile up, and a lot of them become stale. So it's really nice to be able to, in your pipeline for a post step, to always run Docker GC and just clean up anything that's more than a couple hours old, just to finish up and clean up everything in your environment. So there is a lot of flexibility here. Pretty much anything you want to do is possible. But again, we are trying to provide better ways to get you there faster and provide more guidance as opposed to just saying, here's a blank slate, go do whatever the heck you want with that, and then ask questions later, which is not necessarily a good model for getting new people onboarded. So I've got about 5-10 minutes left, so this is pretty decent timing. Any questions out there? One quick thing, make sure either in the Sched app or on your thing to fill out surveys for that. So they're really asking for a lot of feedback here, and it's good for me so they can come back and criticize me again.
And there's surveys on the table too if you prefer. Either one's fine.
Yeah. Any questions on anything covered? Hopefully was this a good overview? Was it too much or too little or?
Hey, for the Blue Ocean UI, from the home page of the Blue Ocean UI, let's say we have like thousands of pipelines or repos, right? So is there an easy way to navigate, like organize all those pipelines by organization or something like that? Like
yeah,
how we do in the classic thing, we can put like a very short list of things and then navigate to them?
Yeah, so one of the things, the goals is to make it to where it's easier to search on those and filter those out. That's one of the things that I know they're working on very as one of their main priorities is how do we filter these and how do we trim this down and everything, because it can be a very long list for that. And we do want to make that. So I would say that that is a priority. I don't know where that is, but if you want, you can contact either Michael Neal or James Dumais. Michael Neal is the engineering manager for Blue Ocean, and James Dumais is the product manager for that. They're very responsive on email or they actually have their own Gitter chat that they're using for Blue Ocean, but they're also on IRC. And Michael Neal is just Michael Neal on IRC, and James Dumais is I386. So if you find, and they're on Twitter, but the same handles too. So if you find them on Twitter, you can ping them those questions and say, this is my problem, can I talk to you about it?
To answer your first question, that was a great overview. I haven't used it yet, so thank you for that. I have a question about, you mentioned the durability of the task. So when the master goes down, then you can, the slave will still execute and then reconnect to the master. What if you wanted to pivot the master, for example, we use immutable servers. So whenever we want to update Jenkins master's version, I would deploy a new server. How would I go for that?
You can actually do a safe restart and it'll, with pipeline running, can't you?
Are you saying the IP changes of the master?
Yeah.
What?
He's saying IP.
Oh, the IP changes?
As long as the agent configuration is still accessible, it should be able to reconnect.
Yeah, if the agent doesn't change, the master should reach out to it.
Okay. So is there a state? Stored on the master to?
Yes, there's a small little tracks.
Okay. So I would have to.
Wherever the master left off, it's going to read that right away. And try to reconnect to whatever the last agent was that was executing.
So similar to what I do now is just move the file system from the old server to the new server and restart Jenkins. Would supposedly work. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, as with anything, test it and let us know if it doesn't work, Brett.
What about if an agent blows up?
Yeah, there's no real way to track if an agent blows up. I mean, that's one of the big, I get that from other people internally, like, well, I'm trying to do this, and how can it be durable if the agent goes away? I'm like, well, if your agent goes away, then your execution environment's gone, and you can't really start from that, because if your agent goes away, all of the files that you've been building up to that point are gone as well. So it's much easier to just start from an agent again and recreate that, because otherwise you're working from an unknown state. Because the workspace is very contextually aware of, I've checked out these files, I've built this jar file, and if that goes away, your next step won't have those files to do anything with.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways you can wrap a retry type logic around that with sort of the pipeline not declarative.
You can use retry and declarative.
Yeah, it's really want something where if it blows up, there's a chance to retry it, go back.
Yeah, there is a retry step, and you can say retry this block 5 times. So it'll go through. And I actually recommend, especially if you're running parallel, what? Yeah, wrap it with a timeout too. Otherwise, if something goes down, it's not coming back, it's just going to be a big long cycle waiting for that.
Hey, Patrick. Thanks for the presentation. It's pretty good, and I've been using Pipeline for a while, and I really like it. It's very helpful. So I have a few questions. We do some builds parallelly. We use the parallel, and we do some builds. So is it like, can we restart if any of the parallel or any of the stage fails? Can we just restart the stage or a parallel?
So with a retry or?
So not with the retry, like let's say like in one stage I have multiple parallels. So I do a build for Linux, Windows, and Mac, and my Windows build failed. I want to just redo the Windows build. Is there anything that I could do to restart?
There's not a restart right now for just a parallel, but they will keep running if something goes down and they're running in parallel. What I typically recommend people to do is the retry with the timeout on each of the parallels. So you're at least assured that if unless something's catastrophic, each of those parallels will keep retrying until it succeeds and gets to the end of that block of all the parallels.
Okay.
And so another thing with the declarative syntax is we have a pull request and an RFC that we're pretty much done with. We're just waiting for Blue Ocean to support it for a new form of parallel that actually supports agent syntax and everything else like a stage would within that parallel branch. So you can actually run parallel across multiple different agents. So if you've got multiple agents, each of those parallel branches can run in a different agent or in a different Docker container and all that. And eventually we want to get to the point of being able to do full matrix builds with very easy syntax in that, because you can kind of do it in scripted now, but in declarative we want to just say, this is a matrix build, these are my matrices, and run that in parallel.
Okay, and a few more points that I want to say, like running the Windows build with using the bat command, it's really hard. Like I have a batch script which I want to execute just like the shell script that you have. You just use the sh command and run the script, and it works. It doesn't work well with Windows. It's been like, is there any documentation or anything that you guys have that I can use for Windows?
So the one thing with Windows is the quoting in Windows is always kind of tough and everything, especially using the batch command. There is a community member that has a pull request out to fully support PowerShell in Pipeline, and hopefully that'll get put in very soon. And then I would say convert that to PowerShell and use that, because that's going to be much more consistent and robust than batch.
Okay. And one more last thing. Sorry, guys, just the last question. So there are certain stages where I intend to do it on a different build agents, but sometimes they run on the same build agents. So when you're doing a pipeline build on the same build agent, the workspace gets messier, and when you try to delete it, it creates some like unusual errors and everything. So is it like recommended to run each stage on a different, like a different agent? Because I generally group the agents and I say, okay, run it on all the Linux, and sometimes it picks the same Linux agents and it gets messier. So
one, there's no problem with running an entire pipeline on one agent. And if you're talking about concurrent builds of the same pipeline, what Pipeline automatically does is for each concurrent build that you have, it will create a new agent per executor. So you'll have a @1, @2, @3 for each of those workspaces. But if you've only got one executor, it's going to jump in and use the same executor right after the last one, the same workspace. So one, I would say, if you're doing that and you've only got the one executor and the one workspace, make sure each build is cleaning up the workspace after itself, because then every new build coming in has got a clean workspace in a known state to start from. It might not be as fast, but at least that way you're assured of having a clean workspace. And the other thing would be maybe add more executors to the same agent, and then they'll run in separate workspaces. Because what it does, it'll take the first one, and take the second one, take the third one, and when it's out of executors, it goes back to the first one and starts doing that one again. So that way at least you've got some cushion to be able to clean up for that.
So we're going to have to take the questions outside now. The next session's about to begin.
Sorry.
But Patrick can certainly answer questions
I'll
outside.
be around, and you can come to the booth, and Kurt and I will be around for asking questions or answering questions as well for that. Thanks, guys.